כי מציון תצא תורה ודבר אדוני מירושלים. 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 כי מציון תצא תורה ודבר אדוני מירושלים.
חג שמח, page 39A, please rise.
ברכו את אדוני המבורך.
ברוך אדוני מבורך לעולם ועד.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד.
May be seated, ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך
סדר את הכוכבים אל נשמרותיהם כי יקרצונו ומעביר יום ומביא לילה ומבדיל בין יום ובין לילה. אדוני צבאות שמו אל חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני המעריב ערבים אהבת עולם בית ישראל מחל תורה מסוף ומשפטים אותנו לימדת ונשמח בדברי תורתך ומצוותיך לעולם ועד.
כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו בהם נגע יומם ולילה ועבדך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני
ברוך שמו
אוהב עמו ישראל. שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך בשוכבך ובקומך וקשרתם לאות על ידיך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך וים שם תשמעותיך.
תתאים את הרצחים איתו בקוש פספת עליך תעשה בעזרת לך. שמתם את דבר אלה ראשיכם שאתם אותם לתחת לבנך ותך וישעריך למם
ויאמר אדוני משה לאמור למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל זה אמת.
אדוני אלוהיכם אמת.
אמת ואמונה וכל זאת, וקיים
Page
עלינו כאור
43A.
אדוני, זלתו ואנחנו ישראל עמו. הפודנו מיד מלכים מלכנו, הגונים וכל העצים לנו. שלם גמול לכל נפשנו, אסון יחלות נתנו.
אסם נפשנו בחיים.
כל צוננו, העושה לנו ניסים כמה בפרעה, אותות ומופתים במלאכה. מכה בברתו כל בכורי מצרים ותזם. ואהוב עליו גבורתו שיבחו גדול לשמו מלכותו ורצון.
Page 44.
ורצון כי אם בלו עליהם משה ומרים ובני ישראל לך נו שירה בשמחה רב ברוך עולם מי כמוך באלים אדוני מי כמוך נהדר בקודש נורא תהילות אוסף מלכותך ראו בניך בוקע ים לפני משה זה אליהו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד יננאי ננאי יננאי ננאי יננאי ננאי
ונאמר כי יפעל אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני
ברוך שמו
גאל ישראל
אמן. Page 45. משכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו לשלום לעמידנו מלכנו לחיים ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך וצפננו מעצה טובה מיוחדת
ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום מעתה ועד עולם ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך ברוך אתה אדוני הפורס סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ועל ירושלים.
Please rise, page 46, וידבר משה.
וידבר משה את מועדי אדוני אל בני ישראל אל בני ישראל היי 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 היי
יתקדש שם הרבה בעמד יברח ירותי וימליך מלכותי
לך יכונו יומכון ובחיי לכל בית ישראל בעלה ובזמן קריב אמרו אמן יש מרבה מברך לעולם עולם היה
יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמד קודשה וכולי לה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן ועלמה ואמרו אמן.
We face Yerushalayim from the Amidah, page 306. 306.
Kaddish Shalem is on page 54. Page 54.
גדל והתקדש שם רבה, נעלמה נברא כרותה ונתמלכותה וחייכון וביום יכון וחי תחולת ישראל, מעגלה בזמן קריב אמרו אמן, יש מרבה מברך, לעלם ולעלמא
יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם וינסה ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמיר קודשה בריחו לעילם מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תשבחתה ונחמתה דמירן מימיו אמרו
אמן. תתקבל צלותיהון ובאותיהון לכל ישראל קודם הבוהון וישמע ואמרו אמן.
יש למה רבה מן שמה וחיים עלינו כל ישראל אמרו אמן.
עושה שלום במרומיו ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו אמן.
Kiddush is on page 79.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי הגפן. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בחר בנו מכל העם ורוממנו מכל לשון וקידשנו במצוותיו. ותיתן לנו אדוני אלוהינו באהבה מועדים לשמחה חגים וזמנים לששון. את יום חג השבועות הזה זמן מתן תורתנו מקרא קודש זכר ליציאת מצרים. קיוונו בחרת ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים ומועדי קודשך בשמחה ובששון הנחלתנו. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש ישראל והזמנים. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא מאורי האש. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם המבדיל בין קודש לחול בין אור לחושך בין ישראל לעמים. בין יום השביעי לששת ימי המעשה בין קדושת שבת לקדושת יום טוב הבדלת. ואת יום השביעי מששת ימי המעשה קידשת הבדלת וקידשת את עמך ישראל בקדושתך. ברוך אתה אדוני המבדיל בין קודש לקודש. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה. ברוך אתה
אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה חג שמח. page 56.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך המלכים הקדוש
ברוך הוא
שנותן שמיים וארץ המושב ושמיים
הוא אלוהינו אין
הוא אלוהינו
וידיו שירותה לברך כי אדוני הוא האלוהים בשמיים ממעל מתחת אין עוד
על כן נקווה לך
על כן נקווה תפארת וזך לאה וגילוי נותן לך קודש הארץ יכירו ידי קודש ותבל כי לך תכרע כל מרשוע כל לשון
ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ. ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו
Mourner's Kaddish on page 58 for those marking on yahrzeit or those in mourning. Yitgadal v'yikadash shemei rabbah.
Amen.
V'yamad divrach v'yurteh v'yamlich malchuteh b'chayechon u'v'yamechon u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala u'v'zman kariv v'yamru Amen. Yesh shemei rabbah mevarach le'olam omer omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריחו לעילה מנקו ברכתה ושירתה תשבחתה ונחמתה דאמירן בעלמה ויאמרו אמן יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן עושה שלום ברממיו ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל יושבי תבל ויאמרו אמן.
Shall we end with a line of Hallel?
3
Something from Hallel.
319.
מן המצר קראתיה
ענני במרחביה
אדוני לי לא ירא
מה יעשה לי אדם
אדוני לי בעוזרי
ואני אראה בשונאי
טוב לחסות באדוני
מי בטוח באדם טוב לחסות באדוני
מי בטוח בנדיבים
כל גויים סבבונים בשם אדוני כי עמילם
זבוני גם סבבוני
בשם אדוני כי עמילם
זבוני חדוברים
דוח וכאש קוצים בשם אדוני כי עמילם
דחו דחיתני לנפול
ואדוני עזר אני
עוזי וזמרתיה
ויהי לי לישועה כל רינה וישועה באור לצדיקים ימין אדוני עושה חיל
ימין אדוני רוממה
ימין אדוני עושה חיל
לא אמות כי יחיה.
מספר מעשיה,
יסור ישרניה,
ולמוות לא נתן אני, פיתחו לי שערי צדק, אהובם הודיה, זה השער לאדוני, צדיקים יבואו.
We invite everyone to get a bite to eat for a little bit, and then we'll begin learning. So just a quick bite to eat.
Yeah, unless you want to drink it. Unless you want to drink it. It's disgusting.
Yeah, well, I've retired last summer. That's why I'm here. I don't work on Shabbos.
Yeah, I think it's here.
It's, yeah.
Coming up. You're gonna take a break at some point?
Do you think we should?
In 2 hours.
You know the crowd here a little better. I mean, it's nice to have a little bit of interactivity, but you can't let it get out of hand with a crowd like this. We've got a lot to cover.
You can call on a few people every so often. We have portable mics because otherwise people can hear each other. So I will pass the mic, and some people are more appropriate, and some people are more inappropriate. You know.
Right.
We're on the Upper West Side. Right. So you have to. Well, I don't have to tell you.
Yeah.
Did you have a nice Shabbat? A nice rest?
Slept for 3.5 hours in preparation, so it's all good.
Great.
Yeah.
You intend to stay up? You slept 3.5 hours. You intend to stay up?
Oh yeah. No, I do it every year.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Great.
And you're sure?
Yeah. And I got a call a couple of weeks ago from somebody in a panic that he said, I'm not sure they're planning to do an all-nighter this year. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? I don't have no authority anymore. He said, I'm just venting. But they ended up doing it. So, yeah. It was a civilian rebellion.
So what, they get a few people to do it?
Yeah, we get people from the community mostly.
Volunteer to teach.
Yeah. Yeah, we generally divide it up into, they know about 10 parts, about a half hour each. Yeah. And I always had a chazaka on what I called the graveyard shift. I was at 4:30 in the morning.
Same with me.
Mine went at 3 o'clock.
Right.
Well, now you're 4.
I'm 3:30 then.
This year.
Right.
3:30.
4:45.
Love my son.
Yeah. You know, we never settled one thing. You're okay with my not being here Monday, yes? Yeah? Okay.
We're just going to tell them
I don't do these.
You know, you don't have to be here tomorrow. I mean, it's like...
Well, I won't. I'll be here at the sunrise service.
Many, when Marshall was alive, said, Yom Tov Sheni, we have to get away with it,
Right.
finish it, Israel, blah, blah, blah. So we send a letter to the congregation saying, unless you, in the time, I don't know, a couple hundred people,
Right.
unless you have any objections, blah, 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 people started writing, calling, and saying, we want Yom Tov Sheni, okay, so we kept
The people, I find that the people by us, the ones, there is a good number who would be clamoring to do away with it. They are by far the most observant people.
really?
Those are the ones who want to do away with it. Because they actually feel bound by it.
Yeah.
And they,
People here like the time.
It's a East one. Maybe it's like that.
But second day of Sukkot we have people, second day of Pesach. It's the in crowd,
right.
All right.
All right. This will be a little bit yet, I guess.
We invite you to find a seat.
Water.
We're going to begin in just a moment.
I'll get some coffee afterwards. Yeah. Okay.
We invite everybody to find a seat. We'd like to begin. Not 200 people.
I said, but he said he's afraid to take them. I said, wait till people sit down and then you'll see.
All right, we'd like to begin. If you would find a seat, please. Chevra, please find a seat.
Rolly, keep this introduction short.
Yeah. Yes, I'm ready. Okay, last call, please be seated. We will have a break in a little while. You can have more cake later. Hi na 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 ni na 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 ni na 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 ni na 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 hi na na hi na na hi na 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 didi nine 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 hi nine 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 didi nine 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 hi nine 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 hi nine 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 hi na 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 didi na 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 didi na 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 didi na 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 hi hi na 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 Nai, nai, na, nai, na, nai, 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 nai. Hey, nai, nai. Nai, nai, na, nai, na, na, nai, nai. Hai, nai, nai. Hai, nai, na, nai, na, nai. האמנתי כי אדבר, אני עניתי מאוד, אני אמרתי בחופזי, כל האדם כוזב. האמנתי כי אדבר, אני עניתי מאוד. I believed, I had faith. Even when I said, אני עניתי מאוד, I'm very troubled or distressed. אני אמרתי בחופזי, I said, it translated here, in my delirium. אני אמרתי בחופזי, I said in my delirium. כל האדם כוזב. Every person deceives. And we live in a time of great deception and mendacity and corruption and lies. And we have to find a path forward with Torah as our guide. And we have the blessing once again of having Rabbi Gordon Tucker as our teacher tonight to help us find a path, God and truth in a time of falsity. I introduced him a little bit of greater length this morning. I will trust that many of you or most of you are here this morning, so I will be a little shorter and just indicate that he is Rabbi Emeritus at Temple Israel Center in White Plains, where he's been a rabbi for 24 years. He's a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He was, and he still is, a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he was the dean from 1984 to 1992. He was a member of the Rabbinical Assembly Committee on Jewish Law and Standards from 1982 to 2007. He occupied many important positions on boards, and we are really happy to study with him tonight on this night of Shavuot and get some clarity in the question of truth and falsity.
Chag Sameach to everyone. It's always nice to be able to have some interactivity, and I hope that we can have a little of that, but it is kind of a large crowd and we have stuff to get through, so we'll try to find the right sweet spot. And if you have questions, and you can keep them kind of concise, we'll try to answer them, or a quick comment about something that will enrich our discussion. We certainly would like to entertain them, but I'll also have to keep an eye on going forward. And if Rolly suggested that we might want to take a break in the middle, which is fine, but I saw how long the break took just now, and so if we're going to do that, we should keep it, like, really be disciplined about it, okay? My goal really for tonight, other than being with you and being part of the celebration of Torah, is in part to explain to you why I've been wearing this button every single day since last October. It says truth. Why I'm very worried about my grandchildren, and a couple of other things. And they will emerge as we go along. So we're going to begin with Ezekiel, from whom we're going to read in a number of hours the famous first chapter, this wild vision he has of these four-faced creatures and wheels and wings and all sorts of things that are representing for him the presence of God, but the movement of the presence of God, the presence of God that is going to be moving out of the temple in Jerusalem. Ezekiel was already in the exile. Ezekiel went into the exile in 597 with the first exile from the Babylonians. 11 years before they destroyed the temple, they took the intelligentsia and all the troublemakers out and brought them to Babylonia, and they left what was called Dalat Haaretz, the the poor people who didn't have much means in the way of means to rebel back in the land, but the temple was still there. There was a puppet king. Ezekiel was obsessed with the corruption that was going on back in Jerusalem, and how the presence of God was just going to leave. And we're going to look at something from chapter 9 right away. It's worth reading through Ezekiel sometimes. If you, I wouldn't recommend doing it just before you go to sleep because it could give you nightmares. But there are some weird, vivid images in here that are really, have you ever been in a health food store and you see Ezekiel bread? They don't tell you what the actual recipe is. I'm not going to ruin this for you, but if you want to see what the actual recipe is, you got to look at chapter 4. That's homework. In chapter 8, just before this, Ezekiel has this vision of God taking him through the temple in Jerusalem, and it's like God saying, you got to see this. Look through this window and see what's going on in there. You can't believe what these people are doing. And this is what chapter 8 is revving him up into this froth about the horrible corruption that is going on in the city of Jerusalem. And so now in chapter 9, look what happens. Now the presence of the God of Israel had moved. The presence here is the kavod, the thick, heavy presence of God, the palpable presence of God. The presence of the God of Israel had moved from the cherub on which it had rested over the ark. That was the throne. God is Yoshev HaKruvim, the one who was enthroned on the cherubim. But the presence of God he now sees has already begun to leave. It's gotten to the platform of the house, to the threshold. And he called to the man clothed in linen, presumably a priest, with the writing case at his waist. And the Lord said to him, pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who moan and groan because of all the abominations that are committed in it. You see the Hebrew there, v'hitvita tav al mitzchot ha'anashim. The tav is this mark. We'll get back to that in a moment. To the others, he said in my hearing, follow him through the city, the one who's leading this posse, the man clothed in linen, and strike, because he's appointed before this 6 kind of targeted assassins. And they're to follow the head of the posse and strike, show no pity or compassion, kill off graybeard, youth and maiden, women and children, but do not touch any person who bears the mark. V'al kol ish asher alav hatav al tigashu. Begin here at my sanctuary, which is kind of, for Ezekiel, the epicenter of corruption. That's pretty tough stuff, right? A tav, what is a tav? So as we're going to see in the Talmudic passage here, tav is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In Paleo-Hebrew, before we started using these block letters in ancient Hebrew, if you want to ever see ancient Hebrew, just get a copy of the movie, The 10 Commandments, and just look at what's written on the tablets. They actually got it right. It's not written in our block letters. The tav was an X. So it's a simple mark. The X on the forehead is going to mark people, apparently, for life, which is interesting, not the way we usually think of a mark on the forehead and an X. These are the people who are going to live. And now the Talmud takes this up in Tractate Shabbat, and there's an interesting back and forth here until finally there's the ultimate punchline. So what is different about the letter Tav, that it was inscribed on the foreheads of the righteous? So the Talmud already understood the Tav to be the letter. So Rav said, well, Tav is the first letter of the word Tichyeh, indicating that the righteous shall live, because Tichyeh means you shall live. Of course, that's an indicator of the imperfect or the future, so it's the beginning of lots of verbs, like Tav is also the first letter of the word Tamut, indicating that the wicked shall die. So there's some ambiguity here, which actually goes back to the text in Ezekiel about, was there a complete killing off of people, or were people actually spared? And we don't have to go into that ambiguity, because the important thing in our text here is where it gets to at the end. Shmuel said Tav is the first letter of the word Tama, ceased, indicating that the merit of the patriarchs has ceased. They have exhausted all of the merit of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're long since gone. They can't draw on any bank account anymore, and they're just going to be destroyed. Rabbi Yochanan said Tav is the first letter of the word Tachon, will have mercy, indicating that the merit of the patriarchs will bring mercy to the righteous. So there's a back and forth as to how many people were spared, right? Were people spared? But now comes Reish Lakish. And he says, no, the letter Tav, the last letter of the alphabet, it's also the last letter of what he calls Chotamo Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the seal of the Blessed Holy One. The seal is, of course, the signet ring, that which tells you this person was here, this person signed, this is an authentic thing. The seal of the Holy and Blessed One means that God was authentically there. And what is the seal of the Blessed Holy One? As Rabbi Hanina said, Chotamo Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Emet. The seal of the Blessed Holy One is truth. So this last letter of the word truth, Emet, the Tav, is going to be the mark that says these are people who are moaning and groaning because of the abominations, because they are seeing through the falsity and they are understanding what is true. Meaning that having that seal, for them, they were conceiving of it as quite literally a lifesaver in difficult and turbulent times. And maybe it's always the case that times get difficult and turbulent when there's a deficit of that seal, right? Works in the other direction too. What creates turbulence, what creates difficulty in times is when there aren't enough people wearing that seal. So what we're going to do in the time that we have here is we're going to look at two different threats to truth. They are distinct, they're different, but in terms of the damage that they do, they are related to one another. And just as a preview, I'm going to call them, and I'll explain this later, I'm going to call them the threat of nihilism, and the threat of formalism. I'm sorry? The second term was formalism. Formalism. I'll explain it, I promise. Okay? But as a prelude to that, I want you to look at the bottom of page 1, and we're going to look at one of our texts that talks about what it believes is the relationship of the human species from its very inception to truth. So this is a not terribly obscure passage. Probably a number of people here may have encountered this at one time or another. Certainly little pieces of it have gotten quoted. I call it How Truth Gets Buried. It's from Genesis Rabbah. Rabbi Simon said, when God was about to create the first human, the ministering angels split into contending groups. You know, this presumably is the Midrash taking very seriously. God says, Na'aseh Adam, let us make a human. So it's as if God is consulting. God's got some consultants there. These are the ministering angels. What do you think about this plan? I think I'm going to create humanity. And now the ministering angels split into contending groups. Some said, yeah, great idea, let the human be created. Others cried, oh God, no. Right? Literally, right? And that's why it's written, Psalm 85, mercy and truth collided, righteousness and peace engaged in a clash. Because here's what happened. And now it's as if angels are personifying they're like Platonic forms, these angels now, personifying certain values. Mercy said, well, let him be created. Humans will do merciful deeds. Truth said, let him not be created. Humanity will be suffused with lies. It'll be an ongoing offense to me, truth. Kol Ha'Adam Kozev. You know, it's one of those great, that we say this in the Hallel, right, is always interesting to me. You know, all men are liars. That's a real celebration, you know, Hallel, right, yes. Okay. That was what truth said. Righteousness said, let him be created, for humans will do righteous deeds. Peace said, let him not be created, for humans will never cease quarreling. It's as if mercy and righteousness are looking at singular things. Yeah, there's going to be this act of mercy and that act of righteousness, and that's good. Everything is an increment. But truth and peace are looking at the big picture from 30,000 feet, and they're saying there's not going to be any truth here, and there's not going to really be any peace here. So what did the Blessed Holy One do? Because this was not actually an honest consultation. God had already made up the divine mind as to what was going to happen. God was going to create humanity. As I mentioned this morning, this was God's gamble on humanity. God took truth and cast it into the ground. This is the myth of our creation that Genesis Rabbah is giving us. That it was the burying of truth that enabled us to rise. That's kind of a tough tale of origins. Yeah? And having turned the page, I've heard the rustling of pages, so you don't need to cue you on this, the top of page 2. So Heschel's posthumously published work, A Passion for Truth, which was largely about the Kotzker Rebbe, Menachem Mendel of Kotzk, but also about the correlations between his thought and that of Soren Kierkegaard. So, Passion for Truth, Heschel writes the following: it seems that this parable that we just read in Genesis Rabbah haunted the Kotzker. Indeed, after all the heady discourses are over, the intoxication gone, one begins to wonder, is truth really buried in a grave? Is it gone? Is it unretrievable like that which is in the grave? The parable openly declares once and for all that man's very existence is founded upon the tomb in which truth is imprisoned. Man prevails only because truth lies buried. So the Kotzker knew that truth lies buried, stifled in the grave, yet it remains alive. That was the Kotzker's insistence, that truth can be resurrected. Not easy, and it was part of his passion, and which, kind of pretty literally drove him mad. Truth wants to emerge, but man does not permit its appearance. Man's structures stand like a mausoleum on the grave of truth, preventing it from raising its head. And actually, deep in every soul, there is a longing to embrace truth, but it has ceased to be felt. Or we might say, we're not sure just how to go about it. And we'll see many of the reasons why as we go forward. That was in the early part of the book. You see pages 13 to 14. In the much later part of the book, much closer to the end, we're in the 300s now, there's this last paragraph where he says the Kotzker could not anticipate the disaster that befell his people during the Holocaust. Heschel goes on to say in that ellipsis, by the way, that I don't believe, Heschel says, he would have been surprised by it. He seems to have had a haunting awareness of the terrible danger of human cruelty. He may not have analyzed the dynamic nature of persecution, yet he was profoundly aware that in a world of lies, the demonic had a free rein. Indeed, when human beings establish a modus vivendi on the basis of mendacity, we make our peace with falsity, the world can turn into a nightmare. This may explain the obsessive preoccupation with falsehood in the Kotzker's thinking, for the Holocaust did not take place suddenly. It was in the making for several generations. It had its origin in the lie that the Jew was responsible for all social ills, and many other lies as well. It's interesting that the Kotzker here seems to be critiquing God's decision to bury truth in order to create human beings. Should have found a better way to create human beings that didn't require the burying of truth. It's sort of the way an ancient midrash that some of you may be familiar with that critiques God's diminishing of the moon. The Genesis chapter 1 says that God created two great lights, Shnei Ma'orot Gedolim, right? And then in the very next phrase, it talks about the great light and the small light. And there's a whole midrash about how the moon wondered how a diarchy is going to work, and God said, you're right, make yourself smaller. And there's a whole critique of this in the Talmudic passage in Tractate Chulin about that. Kotzker is doing that. He's critiquing God's decision as put forth in this midrash. So these texts already give us, heighten for us the problematic of our relationship as a species to truth, and the recognition already in ancient times that this was a problematic relationship. And what does God need from us? What do we owe God? What do we owe ourselves? And how does truth figure into this? So I gave you those two words. So what do I mean by nihilism when considering truth? Because I said we're going to look at two different threats. This is the first one. Nihilism. The sense that there is ultimately no real meaning to it. And the next few texts are going to lay it out for us. At first, I thought it would be good and perhaps a little amusing and entertaining, perhaps, for you to see already the ancient awareness that there's something curiously elusive about truth. So look at a text that may or may not ever have appeared in a set of texts on a Tikkun Leil Shavuot before, the Epistle of Paul to Titus. Only here for one reason, basically not for a theological reason, but for a logical reason. One of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said, he's talking about the people of Crete, okay? And one of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said, the Cretans are always liars. It's not so clear that Paul understood, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, the essential paradox in this. But this was the basis of what's called the Epimenides paradox, that all Cretans lie all the time, and it's said by a Cretan. So is he lying or is he telling the truth? The whole definition of truth in our language lends itself and leads inexorably to all kinds of paradoxes. And there's already an ancient awareness of that. And one of the most amusing of these is in one of our own texts now, in the Talmud Bavli. I allowed the tractate to drop out there. It's Sanhedrin 110a. Sanhedrin 110a. There is no Bavli 110a. Right? Sanhedrin. So Rabbi Bar Bar Chana said, he was a prolific traveler. He was going back and forth to lots of places all the time. He says, one time I was traveling on the road, and a certain Arab said to me, "Psst, come, I'm going to show you where the Korachites got swallowed up." Probably many people here have had confrontations like this somewhere in the Middle East. Right? Someone comes up to you and for a small fee promises to tell you where the baby Moses was floating down the river. Right? So this happened to Rabbi Bar Bar Chana. I'm going to show you where the Korachites got swallowed up. I went with him, and sure enough, I saw two fissures in the earth that were emitting smoke. And to show me that it was like real smoke, it wasn't just steam, it was smoke. There was fire there. He took a patch of wool, wet it with water, put it on the tip of a spear, placed it at that spot, and it got singed. So I could see this fire, there's an inferno going on under there. Remember, the Torah tells us later in the book of Bamidbar, which we began this morning, that Hem Yardu Chayim She'olah, they went down to Sheol, to this underworld, alive. So they were just being cooked there all the time. And then he said to me, well, listen for what you will hear there. So you have to imagine Rabbi Bar Bar Chana kind of puts his ear down towards the fissure, and this is what he heard. What I heard was that they were saying the following: Moses and his Torah are the truth, and we are liars. Are you lying now when you say Moses and the Torah are truth? So there it is. When people can say things that sound straight and sound true, and if you think about what they're really saying, they can play all sorts of mind games with you with this, because truth is hard to pin down in that way. Okay? That was for a little entertainment, just to understand that this is a basic, interesting philosophical issue that people deal with in interesting places, like philosophy departments. Okay. Now we're going to turn to more serious stuff, and it's on page 3. So this is something that Harry Frankfurt published in 2005, Princeton University Press. I don't know whether to apologize for the vulgarity in the title and in the piece, but I think I side with Princeton that it's kind of unavoidable. Let's look at it. The bullshitter may not deceive us or even intend to do so, either about the facts or about what he takes the facts to be. What he does necessarily attempt to deceive us about is his enterprise. His only indispensably distinctive characteristic is that in a certain way, he misrepresents what he is up to. And now he's going to explain. The crux of the distinction between him and the liar. They're both putting out falsehoods, but they're not the same. Both he and the liar represent themselves falsely as endeavoring to communicate the truth. That's what they want you to believe. The success of each depends upon deceiving us about that. But the fact about himself that the liar hides is that he's attempting to lead us away from a correct apprehension of reality. We are not to know that he wants us to believe something he supposes to be false, right? Or a better way to put this, perhaps, is the liar knows what's true, has some odd respect for the truth. The problem is the truth is going to hurt him, so he's going to lead us away from it to protect himself. The fact about himself that the bullshitter hides, on the other hand, is that the truth values of his statements are of no central interest to him. What we are not to understand is that his intention is neither to report the truth nor to conceal it. It's impossible for someone to lie unless he thinks he knows the truth, right? There's a difference between making a false statement and lying. Lying means, I know what the truth is, I have a good grasp of what it is, and I am, for my own purposes, going to lead you away from it. By the way, we all do that. Let's be honest. We're not all shakranim, but we all are all meshakrim, right? We all tell lies in various ways at various times, and it's okay. It's part of humanity. That's different from being a constant liar. You can even be a constant liar and still understand what the truth is. But you have to think you know the truth. Producing BS requires no such conviction. And I'm going to give you, my wife Amy is sitting here. I think she won't mind if I tell you what she has said to me over and over the years, which is she has said, I will never be able to lie to you because I don't think I have a good enough memory. Right? Think about it. When you lie, you have to remember what your lie is. You have to remember what the truth is, and you have to be consistent with it. That's different from not caring what you said on Monday. It doesn't even matter what you said on Monday. Right? You don't need a memory to put out BS. You need a memory to put out lies. That's what Frankfurt is trying to teach us. A person who lies is thereby responding to the truth, and he is to that extent respectful of it. When an honest man speaks, he says only what he believes to be true. For the liar, it's correspondingly indispensable that he considers his statements to be false. For the BSer, however, all these bets are off. He's neither on the side of the true nor on the side of the false. His eye is not on the facts at all, as the eyes of the honest man and of the liar are, except insofar as they may be pertinent to his interest in getting away with what he says. And by virtue of this, BS is a greater enemy of the truth than lies are. 2005, right? This should be required reading for everyone today. right? It has been republished. So, yeah, I see lots of nods, right? We understand the phenomenon. And it is part of this nihilism, right? But the nihilism sometimes has something a little more concrete, shall we say, or something that seems to be a little more respectable to base itself on. And that's what this recently published book, The Death of Truth, by Michiko Kakutani, who used to be a book critic for the Times. So she wrote this, and it's important for us to have a look at it here. So in a 1943 essay, Orwell wrote, this is 43 now, not 2005, 1943, but it's in the middle of World War II. And he's talking about Nazi propaganda primarily. What is peculiar to our own age is the abandonment of the idea that history could be truthfully written. In the past, people deliberately lied, or they unconsciously colored what they wrote, or they struggled after the truth, well knowing that they must make many mistakes, but in each case they believed that facts existed and were more or less discoverable. That's what Frankfurt said was about liars, or people who innocently miss the truth, or even those who are deliberately lying. They believe that facts exist. People trying to win respectability for clearly discredited theories, or in the case of Holocaust, that was the end of the Orwell quote, of course. Now it's Kakutani speaking. In the case of Holocaust revisionists trying to whitewash entire chapters of history, exploited the postmodernist argument that all truths are partial. Before anyone gets uptight about this, they're exploiting it, right? It's not really a correct reading of what postmodernism is about, but the problem is that there's a kind of whiff of respectability about it that the people who are trying to purvey this nihilism about truth are able to base themselves on. Deconstructionist history, the scholar Deborah Lipstadt observed in Denying the Holocaust, has, these are her words, the potential to alter dramatically the way established truth is transmitted from generation to generation. And it can foster a climate in which, again, Lipstadt's words, no fact, no event, no aspect of history has any fixed meaning or content. Any truth can be retold. Any fact can be recast. There is no ultimate historical reality. And now we're back to Kakutani, who is quoting an infamous memo written by a tobacco industry executive in 1969, who said, "Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact," in quotes, "that exists in the minds of the general public." You'll note this about climate deniers. You know, one of the things that has emerged from this phenomenon is that there is absolutely no difference when you get sucked into this kind of discourse. There's no difference between 99-1 and 50-50. Well, not everyone says that. I can find you a couple of people who say that nothing is happening in our climate. So it's now a fair argument, right? This is why Deborah Lipstadt refused ever to appear on some panel with Holocaust deniers. She said, these are not commensurate points of view, right? But the idea that somehow truth can be difficult, that's the relevance of some of these amusing things about the difficulty of defining truth. These things can be exploited to say, well, since we can't really define truth, let's just have it out in our competing narratives. Even if one of them is crackpot to the nth degree and perhaps really nefarious in its conscious and deliberate obliviousness to the evidence. And this is what really vexed Lipstadt. It's what Kakutani brings to our attention in terms of much of the discourse that we find ourselves here. So that we had Frankfurt's distinction between lying and BS. The worrying in this death of truth about the implications of the softness of facts and the weaponization of doubt. Note how truly contemporaneous it feels to consider Orwell from the 1940s and even the Kotzker from the 19th century. Because the Kotzker already saw that it could turn life into a nightmare. That's what Heschel brought to us. Of course, we needn't underscore that the history of the 20th century, and now, unfortunately, our own century teaches us that this can be quite serious, and that it also comes home specifically to Jewish interests as well. So one of the things that is often attributed to the Kotzker is he said that everything can be imitated except for truth. Because when you start to imitate, if you try to imitate truth, it's not going to be truthful anymore. The problem is we are living in a society now where technology allows just about anything to be faked. Just had a few days ago with Nancy Pelosi. Yeah, I tell you, I worry about my grandchildren. The ones who are ages 9 and up, I think they're okay. Right? The 4-week-old and her 2.5-year-old brother, I'm not exactly sure how they're going to learn growing up what the difference between true and false is. Because in the same way that Nancy Pelosi was shown a certain way, they could, I don't know how this would come about, but it's certainly technically possible for them one day to turn on YouTube and find me, their grandfather, declaiming in my own voice the words of Mein Kampf. It can be done. How are they going to sort this out? How are they going to learn? How are we going to teach them this distinction? And so I don't know what we're going to do about that, which is why I walk around like a little bit of a crazy person wearing this button all the time, because it's like my homage to something that I'm worried that we are losing. I'm not crazy? Well, that brings us to the next text, of which this always reminds me now, which is the top of page 4. And this is a text, one of the tales of the Bratslava Rebbe. It's usually referred to as the tale of the tainted grain. And you'll see how it relates back in a way to Ezekiel. A king once told his prime minister, who was also his good friend, "I see in the stars that whoever eats any grain that grows this year will go mad. What's your advice?" So the prime minister replied, "Well, we'll have to put aside enough grain so that we will not have to eat from this year's harvest. Because society depends on us. We're the governors. We need to remain sane." The king objected, "But then we'll be the only ones who will be sane, and everyone else will be mad. Therefore, they will think that we are the mad ones. It's impossible for us to put aside enough grain for everyone. Therefore, we too must eat this year's grain. But we will make a mark on our foreheads." Isn't that interesting? "So that at least we will know that we are mad. I will look at your forehead, you will look at mine, and when we see this sign, we will know that we are both mad." I'm not going to try to interpret this for you. I'm not even sure it lends itself to a pure interpretation. It's impressionistic. And it's telling you something about how difficult it can be to establish truth in a society and to establish what is sane and what is nuts. And how do you avoid the equivalence of these things? So at least there might be some little recognition left that when I see that mark, it'll remind me, yeah, we're mad. I can't really pull myself out of it, but we're mad. Maybe with Ezekiel, the people who were walking around Jerusalem with this tav on their foreheads were reminding themselves, this may be a corrupt society, but we still care about truth. Truth may be buried, but as the Kotzker, according to Heschel, said, I believe that people still want to resurrect it. They just don't know how. So in partial rescue for us comes a very colorful character, Stanley Fish. And I have a slight mashup of two articles that he wrote 15 years apart. One of them was in the Times, you see, October 15th, 2001. This was just days after the military campaign in Afghanistan began. This was a month after 9/11. And it was in early October. I remember it very well. It was the day of the Chazon bike ride that the military campaign began. And then in 2016, in the middle of the presidential campaign, he wrote this other article called Don't Blame Nietzsche for Donald Trump. Okay. So let's look at what he has to say. During the interval between the terrorist attacks and the United States response, 3 weeks, a reporter called to ask me if the events of September 11th meant the end of postmodernist relativism. No, this was a reporter who was savvy enough to say, oh yeah, you kind of traffic in this postmodernist stuff. What do you say now, right? Are you going to tell us that we can't react to this because all narratives are the same? Right? You call it a terrorist, they call themselves freedom fighters. You think they're unjust, they think they're just. No one thinks they're unjust, everyone thinks they're just. So what are you going to do about this? So this is what the reporter asked him, and not a bad question from a reporter. The problem, according to the critics, is that since postmodernists deny the possibility of describing matters of fact objectively, they leave us with no firm basis for either condemning the terrorist attacks or fighting back. We're going to get to what he says about that, but in the middle is this piece from 2016. Peter Pomerantsev writes in a recent issue of Granta magazine, this equaling out of truth and falsehood is both informed by and takes advantage of an all-permeating late postmodernism and relativism. This school of thought has taken Nietzsche's maxim, there are no facts, only interpretations, to mean that every version of events is just another narrative where lies can be excused as an alternative point of view or an opinion because it's all relative and everyone has their own truth. And now Fish says, and we're going back to 2001 now, but it's a fitting response to what he just wrote in 2016 as well. Not so, he says. Postmodernism maintains only that there can be no independent standard for determining which of many rival interpretations of an event is the true one. There can't be an independent standard. What postmodernism says is that while the material world certainly exists, there is a reality and is prior to our descriptions of it. It's not just phenomenalism here. It's that there are no real facts. There is only our imaginations or interpretations of it. We only have access to it through those descriptions. The only thing postmodern thought argues against is the hope of justifying our response to the attacks in universal terms that would be persuasive to everyone, including our enemies. Right? Can I digress here for a second? I always get a kick out of you go to a pro-Israel rally on some moment where there has been an attack, there's some danger, you want to support Israel, you go to the rally, but sometimes you see signs there that you're a little uncomfortable with, or that are kind of, I don't know how to put it, they're just like weird. It's like, I love the sign that says, read the Bible, the land is ours. And I sort of imagine people sitting in Ramallah now, watching this and saying, "Oh, God, how did I miss that?" Right? Of course, I should have read this, right? It's this idea that we have some universal terms that are going to convince our enemies about it. Of course we're not. That's what we have learned, right? That doesn't work. There is no hope of justifying our response to the attacks in terms that would be persuasive to our enemies. Invoking the abstract notions of justice and truth to support our cause wouldn't be effective anyway, because our adversaries lay claim to the same language. No one declares himself to be an apostle of injustice. Instead, he says, listen to this, we can and should invoke the particular lived values that unite us and inform the institutions we cherish and wish to defend. We're not going to war in Afghanistan against the people who attacked us on some whim. We are appealing to decades, centuries of a polity, a society, a civilization that has certain institutions that have informed our whole way of life. That gives us warrant for saying we are going to go and defend this. We don't have to be able to convince other people. We have to try. But the fact that we can't doesn't vitiate our right to be standing in defense of the things that we know to be true. We may not know them to be true in the same way 50 years from now. The great philosopher of science, Karl Popper, had this great image of, he says, the way science works, and he had other people who disagreed with this, but his image was, the way science works, it's like you're going to build an edifice, and you have to put the pilings down that are going to support the edifice as far down as they will be secure. You may not actually hit bedrock, but you're going to hit a place where it's going to be more than secure enough for now. It doesn't guarantee that you may not have to drive them down further later on. But that's how science works, that's how human morality works. And so, to the threat of truth nihilism, and this is why I wanted you to see these words from Stanley Fish, because he's charting out for us a course between twin dangers. Right? And if you take nothing else away from this tonight, I want you to just have this little encapsulation. You can think, there are people who think that they have access to the whole truth, and there are people who think that it is hopeless to be able to talk about truth at all. And those are both dangerous. There is something that has to be charted out in the middle. And we've gotten a little lost on that. Fish has, I think, begun to chart for us in this passage the course between these two dangers. One is a flawed and dangerous claim to be the sole possessor of objective truth, and the other is a thoroughgoing relativism that can fall into this nihilism that doesn't at all need to follow from a skepticism. It doesn't have to follow from a skepticism about achieving and attaining the objective truth. Heschel himself, by the way, in the book on Kotsk, he talked about how important truth was to him as well, but he called it a precarious value. And I think he meant it was a precarious value because of that first fear, which is that people sometimes come and they claim to have possession of that truth. But we can't give it up, because to give it up is to fall into the other vortex that threatens to sink us. So Fish is telling us that something short of that certainty, a limitation to which we have to reconcile ourselves, can still suffice to create a robust civilization that defends itself even as it avoids claims to a godlike possession of the truth. So that really is part one. a better understanding, I think, and with some reference to some of our own sources and some of our history as to what this nihilistic threat to truth is today, why we have this fakery. It doesn't tell us how exactly we're going to deal with the fact that so many things, or nearly everything, can be forged today. That's something we're going to have to be aware of and try to work out. I certainly don't have an answer for you tonight, other than the fact that I'm deeply worried about it, not so much for myself, but for future generations. But this is, I think, at least the roadmap that we've just seen for how one can try to plow that middle ground. So we're going to go forward in a few minutes, and this will probably be a good time to take a brief break. Let me just say we're going to go forward to the second threat to truth. I called that the truth of formalizing, the threat of formalizing truth. And we're going to be in the realm of specifically Jewish thought and practice. And Jewish thought and practice has created its own problematic about truth, which, as I said at the beginning, is a little different from this, but has some of the same bad effects. And when we come back in a few minutes, and I really urge you to try to make this just 5 minutes, I'll give you a quick preview of what we're going to study next, and then we'll go to those texts. So whether it's the restroom or some coffee or whatever, 5 minutes, or 11:05, we'll be back to work.
Have you seen the show Chernobyl?
Have I seen
Chernobyl? It's a 5-part series.
Oh, no.
You have to
Yeah.
watch it. And there's an amazing scene where a scientist is confronting a lackey who had been, I think he was a shoe factory guy who was promoted, and he talks about his interpretation. I like my interpretation better about the dangers of what's going on. And it was like astounding, but it's exactly what it's all about. I highly recommend it. It's an amazing, it's, I think, a 5-part show. It's on either Hulu or Amazon or one of those Netflix. It's amazing.
Good, thank you.
There were echoes, very, very important echoes in all of this.
I'm sorry? It came from someone who is working. Oh, you know? Ah. I thought you were asking me how I got it. Wow. So it was someone who worked for Indivisible who gave it to me. They were giving it out. Yeah.
I have to see it. I don't wear it all the time.
I feel a little like a crazy prophet walking around with one cloth or something, but I feel like it's not there.
I'm from the Roman congregation of David. I used to say it.
Very the truth. Yeah. Thank you for telling me. So what her name is? Mary
Frank.
Mary Frank. Okay. Is it?
Her first husband
It's
was
not
Robert
signed.
Frank.
It's not signed here. No.
Her first husband was Robert Frank. And there's a movie about it.
Hi. So what was your family name?
And there was a group on campus where I had to be
Well, since I do, as you might imagine, get to that track to the cemetery from time to time, I'll look for them. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
There are truths that everyone will have to agree upon. We are all mortal. We will have to eat.
Yeah.
We're there.
And that's why we need a break. Right? It's 11:06, folks.
Question.
Yes.
So, what do you say regarding this? First, we notice my partner. So, what do you have to say if someone is this with God facts like all photos?
Well, that's what Frankfurt is talking about. Yes. Okay. Very good. So I want to put two words out here now. One of them is the word truth, and the other is the word validity. And I'll tell you what I mean by it. Truth, in a kind of let's talk informally. We're not trying to do a precise definition that was going to pass at the American Philosophical Association. Talking informally, truth is talking about something and apprehending something that sort of corresponds to the way things actually are. That's an idea that goes way back to Aristotle. Validity has to do with, well, think of it, Sometimes there has to be a determination in the courts as to whether something is a validly enacted law in Congress or in a state legislature. Were the systems followed correctly? Were the rules followed? Was it produced in a way that is canonical? Okay? That makes something valid. Right? I'll give you an interesting example. You know, the Torah says that a Kohen, a priest, is not supposed to marry a woman who is divorced. We're not going to get into the history of all of that. We're just telling you what the Torah says. All right? We read it a couple of weeks ago. Right? What if a Kohen marries someone who is divorced? According to rabbinic law, the marriage is valid. Doesn't mean it's legitimate. It doesn't mean it's sort of following the divine truth, right, of way things should be. But if you said, Harei mikudeshet li b'tavat zo, and you gave her the ring, and there were witnesses there. So what does it mean for a marriage to be valid? It means if you want to get out of that marriage, you need to either die or get divorced, right? That's that great line that probably you've heard. You know, I don't know what the percentage is now, but they say, 55% of marriages today end in divorce. The other 45% end in death. Well, that's true, right? There are only two ways. So you need a little bit of levity late at night. So that's what it means to be valid. It's not quite the same as true. We would like valid to be the same as true. We try to construct our systems in such a way that they will produce things that are true. But the whole reason we do amendments to laws and we change things is because we come to realize that there's something not quite right about the validity of this in terms of whether it is really tracking what we think it ought to be tracking. So in going forward to look at the things we're going to look at, the little preview I want to give you is the ideas that I want to propose and promote. So one is that even though our tradition, our Jewish tradition, has laboriously and lovingly produced texts and traditions and generations of revered sages and systems of inference about what the good Jewish life is, which is the sort of things that go on in rabbinical assembly law committees, right? I'm going to claim we cannot and should not identify all of the truths about what it means to be a servant of God with the validity of those texts and systems. Okay? We're going to look at this. I'm going to say it a little more starkly. I don't think we can present ourselves to the world as a great world religion only because we have adopted for ourselves what is admittedly, and I mean this very deeply because that's what I've devoted my life to, only because we've adopted for ourselves a beautifully rich body of exegesis and reasoning that proceeds from first principles to create more and more structure for living, but that almost never refers to God. One of my ineradicable memories from the 25 years I served on the Rabbinical Assembly Law Committee was that early on, when I was still pretty young, I remember a much more senior colleague saying when someone had the temerity to mention God or theology there, and he said, do you know what my theology is? My theology is shor shenagachet hapara, that when an ox gores a cow, right? All the civil laws of Bava Kama and Bava Metzia and Bava Batra, this is my theology. All I need to know about what I am to be as a servant of God is what is produced by our texts and our systems. I don't think we can present ourselves to the world as a great religion on that basis. I think one of the most beautiful lines in the Tanakh is one that unfortunately is never read as a haftarah. It comes from the end of the 8th chapter of Zechariah. And he says the following, thus said the Lord of hosts, in those days, looking to the future, people from nations of every tongue will take hold of every Jew by a corner of the cloak and say, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Anticipating something we're going to look at in the course of this second hour that we have, I'm going to say, it does not say, let us go with you because we have heard that you had the courage and the chutzpah to banish God from the Beit Midrash and to use a phrase, lo bashamayim hi, which is not in heaven, to absent God from your religious thought. It said, let us go with you because we have heard that God is with you. And an ultimate point I'm going to make with some help from Martin Buber is that as religious people, we may owe it to God to care about what is not comprised by our human systems, what the valid things that our halakha produces, that which it cannot necessarily express all by itself. All of this will come clear, I think. I just wanted to give you that little preview of what is here. We're going to start with the text on page 5. So, first of all, quickly read through this passage from the Torah from Deuteronomy. The setting here is there's been some kind of case that has arisen, and you've gone to the local people who adjudicate these things, and they're in a quandary. They don't know what to do. It's going to get kicked up to a higher court. If a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it controversy of a homicide, civil law, assault, matters of dispute in your courts, you shall promptly repair to the place that the Lord your God will have chosen, appear before the Levitical priests or the magistrate in charge at the time, present your problem. When they have announced to you the verdict in the case, who is the you here? The you is the litigant. When they have announced to you the verdict, you shall carry out the verdict that is announced to you from that place that the Lord chose, observing scrupulously all their instructions to you. If they ordered you to pay a certain fine with certain punitive damages, you had better do it. You shall act in accordance with the instructions given you and the ruling handed down to you. You must not deviate from the verdict that they announced to you, either to the right or to the left. Yamin usmol. And should a man act presumptuously and disregard the priest charged with serving the Lord your God or the magistrate, that man shall die, a little extreme. Thus you will sweep out evil from Israel. People have to respect the courts. Okay. Now the Sifrei, body of midrashim of halachic import mostly, on the book of Deuteronomy, tells us the following. It parses this phrase that I had in bold italics, so it's going to go phrase by phrase. In accordance with the instructions, the word here is Torah, given you, so they say it's a capital offense to disregard a matter of Torah, but not so with rabbinic laws. Right? Not terribly important for us, but just you see they're taking Torah literally. Right? You can be executed for disregarding the court on a matter of biblical law, but not on a matter of rabbinic law. You shall act in accordance with the ruling handed down to you. This makes it a positive command. You must not deviate from the verdict. This makes it a negative command. Now comes the punchline. To the right or to the left. Even if their directive seems to you to be making right into left and left into right, you must heed them. Speaking of Orwell, it's pretty Orwellian in sound, isn't it? In the pshat, in the contextual meaning of the Torah, it was about a psak, a verdict, and it was about obedience on the part of a layperson who has gotten a ruling as a litigant. Now it becomes, in the rabbinic mind, a matter of general discipline among the sages themselves, because this is part of a rabbinic construct of what's called the Zaken Mamre, the sage who is now kind of rebelling against and undermining the authority of the court by dissent. So even if you are convinced that they are telling you right is left and left is right, you have to follow them. It has now become about the general and coercive authority of the Bet Din. Okay, now it gets complicated. First it got Orwellian, now it's getting complicated. Because there's a Mishnaic tractate known as Horayot, basically deals right from the outset on the possibility that courts can be wrong. So look what it says. If the court gave an instruction to violate any one of the commandments in the Torah, and an individual went and acted in accordance with their ruling, thus without sinful intent, I'm following their ruling, right? Yeah, there's a kashrut symbol on the food. It's okay, right? Someone said it was okay. Then no matter what the members of the court themselves did or didn't do, he's free of liability because he relied on the court. Right? The issue that they're talking about in liability here is they're talking about a kind of a high-level prohibition for which in temple times you would have to bring what's called a chatat, what Jack Milgram calls a purification offering, that you bring for an inadvertency, for an inadvertent violation of some high-level thing. You ate on Yom Kippur because the court told you yesterday was Yom Kippur, and you ate yesterday when yesterday was Yom Kippur, and and it was really today. You ate today. It was Yom Kippur. You did it accidentally. You're going to have to bring a chatat. But you don't have to do it if you relied on the court. But if the court gave such an instruction and one of them knew that they erred, okay, this is yada echad mehem sheta'u. One of the members of the court knew that they erred, or it doesn't even have to be a member of the court, could be a student of Torah who would be qualified to sit on the court, someone who's learned enough to know they got it wrong, and he acted in accordance with their ruling. He says he's relying on them, but he actually has no right to rely on them, according to this. Then no matter what the members of the court themselves did or didn't do, he is liable for the infraction because he did not rely on the court. And this is the general principle. One who acts in the face of his own knowledge has liability, and one who acts in reliance on the court has none. Okay, is that clear, more or less? There's a problem here that maybe you picked up. I said that this liability is only for inadvertencies. We're talking about someone who says, I know they're wrong, and I'm going to say I'm relying on them. In what sense is that an inadvertency? So the Yerushalmi, the Talmud of the land of Israel, is going to take this up in a really fascinating way. The first thing they do is they said someone who is qualified to sit on the court. So who could that be? So Ravi Imi said in the name of Ravi Shimon ben Lakish, the Mishnah is referring to someone sitting on the court like Shimon ben Azai. Shimon ben Azai, for whatever reason, was kind of this icon for the rabbis of the know-it-all. He knew everything. There's a great line where the later sage Abaye wants to, it's like sometimes you come into a group and you say, ask me anything. So Abaye wanted to say, ask me anything. The way he chose to say it was, Hareini kaven Azai b'shukei Tiberia. I'm like Ben Azai in the streets of Tiberia, Tiberias, which means, here I am, I'm like Ben Azai, you can ask me anything. Because he was the know-it-all. So it has to be someone like Shimon ben Azai who would know that they're wrong. And now, how shall we understand this, they says? If he knows the entire Torah but did not know this matter, it's so much fun to slip into yeshivish, if he knows, right? Then he's not of the caliber of Shimon ben Azai, If he knows this matter but does not know all the rest of the Torah, then still he's like Shimon ben Azai with respect to this matter, and therefore he knows it's wrong, and therefore it shouldn't be bringing a chatat. You don't bring a chatat for a deliberate sin. So rather, listen to this. We must say that he knows the entire Torah as well as this particular matter, but he errs in thinking that the Torah said that we must follow them no matter what. His mistake is thinking, yes, I know they're wrong, but I think I'm supposed to follow them even when they're wrong. And that's his inadvertent sin. Right? And then they say, wait a minute, but if he errs about that, he's clearly not Shimon ben Azai would certainly have known that, right? The Shimon ben Azai thing is a red herring here. We're not really, it doesn't carry much for us here, but look what happens next. So the reason any Ben Azai would know that is because a baraita is now being brought. So what is a baraita? A baraita is what I call the stuff on the cutting room floor, right? It's the stuff that didn't make it into the Mishnah, but the Talmud considers it to be of equal authority because it comes from the Tannaitic period. Here's this baraita that they bring. Might you think that if they tell you right is left and left is right, that you should heed them? Listen to how turns the Sifrei on its head, right? The Sifrei said, lo tasur yaminu small, don't deviate to the right or to the left. Even if they tell you right is left and left is right, you have to follow them. And here the Yerushalmi brings this baraita that says, might you think that if they tell you right is left and left is right, that you should listen to them? The Torah therefore says, lalechet yaminu smol, to go to the right and to the left, i.e., provided that they tell you that right is right and left is left. Now, many things that are fascinating about this, one of the things that are fascinating about this is that today it's very easy to look up with all sorts of databases, concordances, and all of that. The phrase lalechet yaminu smol does not actually appear anywhere. Right? There is no such phrase anywhere in the Torah. There have been a few kvetching ways of try to come to it, but that in itself adds a other layer to this. Like when something is kind of bent a little bit in order to make a point, it means that's how important the point is. Right? That's how important it is for us to make this point, that the authority of the court ceases when they tell you right is left and left is right. So this has gotten us right into the crux of, do we want to identify truth with validity? Here we're not talking about nihilism anymore. We're not talking about denying that there's truth. But we're saying we can't really get to truth, and therefore we're going to create a substitute. And the substitute is going to be our systemic validity. And this now kind of throws down the glove and challenges it on this idea that it's an error to think that you must follow them blindly. So we have this interesting tension now, the desire to maintain order and to suppress dissent, and at the same time, voices that say that one may have an obligation to dissent. So we're going to take a little but important excursus here to something that was written by Gary Wills now 25 years ago. A couple of my students are here. They have already looked at this text. It's from a book about leadership. And this is a chapter about traditional leadership. And he reflects on what John the 23rd did in convening the Second Vatican Council, which was controversial. Okay? So look what he says. Pope John the 23rd did not fight the Curia on its own ground. He would go around it in two ways, through encyclicals and through a universal ecumenical council, two ancient instruments. There was nothing necessarily liberating about calling a council of the world's bishops, right? The Council of Nicaea, for example, in the 4th century, this was hardly a liberalizing body. These had begun as ways of deciding and imposing orthodoxy. On the other hand, calling a church council is something like calling a constitutional convention in the United States. It risks opening up unforeseen questions and becoming a runaway body. The Curia, meaning, the church hierarchy, they were freaked out by this, right? They worked hard and long to anticipate and prevent such breakaway developments. John, with his genuine trust in the Holy Spirit. Here we get some cute words. Hoped that some providential afflatus. Anyone ever hear that word before? Of course not. But he didn't make it up. It's related to the word inflate, right? Afflatus is a gust of wind, right? That He hoped that some providential afflatus would strike the bark of Peter. This is an old obsolete use of the word bark, which means a boat. The bark of Peter is the church, right? And so he hoped that some providential wind would hit the sails of the church and drive it in new directions. John was not a liberal in any consistent or temperamental sense. Personally, he got along with traditionalists in the Curia. He would have sat on the law committee for 25 years, happily, right? He studies Gemara and, etc. He differed from them only because he believed more deeply than they in traditional doctrines like the divine inspiration of the church. Lo and behold, I think this has something to do with God and not just with church law. The hereditary ruler must accept the validating myth of his own office if he is to use it effectively. And the validating myth of the office is the call. Where does the call come from? The call comes from, a divine spirit. Suppress that, and you have suppressed the validating myth. So John gambled with history because he was so sure that God was on his side. He couldn't prove it. But this, we're back to Stanley Fish now, to have sufficient surety based on what you know, what you have lived, everything that your tradition and your life and your calling has taught you, gives you enough surety that you can bomb Afghanistan and you can take a chance with a Second Vatican Council. I hate to put those two together, but those are the things that the examples that we're looking at. Next to this man's divine recklessness, the calculating Pius XII looks like an unbeliever. Right? He was the symbol of you do everything according to the rules, according to Hoyle. That looks like unbelief next to someone who is willing to believe that there is a divine truth that is going to bring us in the right direction. A shallow reading of Pope John's impact would say that he succeeded by deserting tradition, so how could you call him a traditional leader? Certainly the conservatives of the Curia thought that he had betrayed tradition instead of upholding it. Vernacular in the Mass, horrendous, right? But John embodies the paradox of all traditional leadership. If it relies only on tradition, the thing handed down becomes something different at the end of the process. Might not be exactly religion anymore. The tradition must be, here's another great word, repristinated, made pristine again, right? If it is to be worth following. Okay. So he's having us ask, who's the real traditionalist? Who's the real traditionalist? And our friend Reish Lakish had also said at one time, Pa'amim shebitula shel Torah zehu yisuda. Sometimes what looks like departure from the Torah turns out to be the way to uphold it. That's not some modernist saying that. That's one of our Talmudic sages. This is the problem of formalization. When we reduce truth or redefine truth as validity. Heschel, in fact, wrote about this in what was probably his very first paper that he wrote in the United States. He wrote it in 1944, and it was a paper called The Quest for Certainty in the Philosophy of Saadia Gaon. And here's the great line that was in that article. He said, "Not all that is evident is capable of being demonstrated." Right? Capable of being demonstrated means I can validly produce it for you. I can show you the way I can prove the Pythagorean theorem to you. I can show you how something follows from our first assumptions. But something can be evident in, now what does that mean? To the prophets it meant, God said it to me last night. But since we're talking about Matan Torah tonight, what is a non-fundamentalist way of thinking of the Torah? As something that over time became evident to people who were at that mountain and who heard the stories about that mountain and who lived out what they felt the encounter with God meant to them, and eventually it results in this text that is so precious to us that we keep it in the most precious place in the synagogue. That's what it means to have, for something to be evident to you, even though I might be able to prove something about Hilchot Shabbat, the laws of Shabbat, from the first principles that are in the Torah, but I can't prove the Torah to you from first principles that are prior to it. That's something that is evident to us. Not all that is evident is capable of being demonstrated. As Heschel's way of saying, I refuse to identify truth with validity. The validity is important. It's the way in which we live our lives. We go off the rails when we think that that is all that we need to look at if we are after some kind of truth. And so for this, I want to turn now to this autobiographical story from Martin Buber. So it appeared, there's a new book about Buber from Paul Mendes-Flohr, and this was from Maurice Friedman's The Philosophy of Martin Buber, and there's a section in there called Autobiographical Fragments, and he gives us this story that was part of Buber's Nachlass, his papers that were left. So he says, I once met on a journey, we're at the bottom of page 6, a man whom I already knew through an earlier meeting. He was an observant Jew who followed the religious tradition and all the details of his life pattern, but what was for me essential was that this relationship to tradition had its origin and its constantly renewed confirmation in the relationship of the man to God. So he meets someone who's a fromme Yid, right? But his eye is caught by it, or his ear is caught by the fact that not necessarily the run-of-the-mill ones that I have met, right? This person seems to be a little different because there seems to be some of this repristination in him, right? There's a renewed confirmation in his relationship to God, which no doubt Buber says, this is a guy I can talk to, even though we may not do Shabbat the same way. So I now saw him again. I had met him before. I now see him again, and we came to speak of that section of the book of Samuel in which it is told how Samuel delivered to King Saul the message that his dynastic rule would be taken from him because he had spared the life of the conquered prince, really King Agag of the Amalekites. You probably know that story. In 1 Samuel, it's... I said before, I wish that line from Zechariah that I mentioned before was sometimes read as a haftarah. I wish this weren't read as a haftarah. It is every year at Parshat Zachor, but it's good to read these problematic texts because they stimulate our thinking again about them. So here is Samuel delivering the message that you were a little too merciful to your enemy and therefore you can't be the king anymore. And what's more, I'm going to take my machete and hack this king to pieces, even though he's already in custody. So I reported to my partner in dialogue how dreadful it had already been to me when I, as a boy, to read this as a message of God. And this is Samuel, he's a prophet. This is God telling, how is that possible, this boy is saying to himself? And my heart compelled me to read it over again, or at least to think about the fact that this stood written in the Bible. I can't just dismiss it. I told him how already at that time it horrified me to read or to remember how the heathen king went up to the prophet with the words on his lips, surely the bitterness of death is past, and then was hewn to pieces by him. I said to my partner, to this frum guy, I have never been able to believe that this is a message of God. I do not believe it. So these are fighting words when you're talking to someone who is very, deeply rooted in, religious orthodoxy. I'm using orthodoxy with a small o here. So with wrinkled forehead and contracted brows, the man sat opposite me, and his glance flamed into my eyes. He remained silent, began to speak, saying silent again. He didn't know how to respond to this kind of heresy, right? So, he broke forth at last, so you don't believe it? No, I answered, I do not believe it. Stands his ground. So, now he's sounding threatening. You don't believe it? And I once again, no. What do you believe then? I believe, this is Buber speaking, I replied without reflecting, that Samuel has misunderstood God. And he, again slowly but more softly than before, said, so "You believe that?" And I said, "Yes." And then we were both silent. Now, here's the really interesting part. Now something happened, the like of which I've rarely seen before or since in this my long life. The angry countenance, so you have to imagine, remember his face is contorted, right? Because he's trying to figure out, how do I deal with this kind of heresy? What do you believe? How can you say that this isn't God's word? It's in the Tanakh, right, etc. And now something happens. The angry countenance opposite me became transformed as if a hand had passed over it, soothing it. It lightened, cleared, was now turned toward me bright and clear. "Well," said the man with a positively gentle, tender clarity, "I think so too." And again we became silent for a good while. Now I should add here, I have no way of knowing, and I don't think any of us have any way of knowing whether this actually happened. But the message that it's giving, the point that it's making, is a truly important one, because what has he described here? He has described a person who was in a certain kind of tension his whole life, having to find some way to ascribe this to God because it was written in Scripture. And Buber comes along and gives him suddenly a key that he didn't have before, which is, I don't have to ascribe this to God. I don't have to believe in a God who does this and commands this. I can believe in the fallibility of a human prophet. God's off the hook. No wonder his face relaxes. Something he's been burdened with has now been lifted from him, because he's been allowed to pay attention to his truth about God. And so Buber ends this by saying, there is the end, nothing astonishing in the fact that an observant Jew of this nature, when he has to choose between God and the Bible, chooses God. The God in whom he believes, the God in whom he can believe. Again, let's go back to Stanley Fish. It's not a God he's going to be able to convince everyone else about, but it's the God that he believes in. It's the God that accounts for everything that he has known in his life, and why he lives his life the way he does, why he comes to a Tikkun on Shavuot, why he fasts on Tisha B'Av, why he does all the things that he does. It's because of this God that he believes, and that is his truth about God. And he's got to choose that even when Scripture itself may be giving him a different picture. And always when I have to translate or to interpret a biblical text, I do so with fear and trembling, in an inescapable tension between the Word of God and the words, this plural is important there, of man. So he's not advocating just throwing something out. I mean, remember, he said, I have to read this over and over again. I have to contend with the fact that it's in the Bible. But I can't start with the axiom that since it's in the Bible, I will suppress everything else I know about God. That's the difference between truth and validity. And this is a different kind of threat to truth that comes up in our own times, whether it's for political issues or sexual morality issues or whatever it is. One of the things that we have to be on guard about. So, this is what I meant when I introduced this section. I said that we may owe it to God to pay attention to that which may not be produced by our conventional systems. Right? You sort of have to imagine, if I were God, would I like people thinking of me as this kind of a cruel God? What do we owe God in this, in thinking about what truth is? So finally, we're going to turn to what is perhaps the best known text here. The problem is it's known not quite well enough. It's best known in its partiality. The final paradox here tonight is that this is what's usually offered as the proof text for the opposite of what I've been teaching and suggesting here, which is what the majority of the rabbis say is what God wants us to do. Right? So I want you to read it with me and decide for yourselves. Okay? We're picking up in the middle of the story. You know this is about an arcane matter of purity law. Rabbi Eliezer is up against, as an individual, against the rest of the rabbis. And there have been a number of ways in which he's tried to convince them. You know, we're back to Stanley Fish. You think you're going to do it in universal terms that's going to convince the others? It's not going to happen. But he keeps trying. So let's pick it up in the middle of the story. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, well, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of the study hall will prove it. The walls of the study hall leaned inward and began to fall. Rabbi Joshua scolded the walls thus, and the words are important. If Torah scholars are contending with each other, menatzchim ze et ze, they're contending with each other in matters of halakha, right? Menatzchim sometimes you think means defeating, but they can't defeat each other, right? One defeats the other, so it has to mean are attempting to defeat the other, or contending with each other. So how is that your business? Your walls, what do you have to do with this? So the walls didn't fall because of deference due to Rabbi Joshua. They didn't straighten because of deference due to Rabbi Eliezer, and they remained leaning still. A great etiological story for why the walls of the Beit Midrash seem to be leaning like the Tower of Pisa. I have a story for you. You know, this is why. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. And a divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, since the halakha is always in accordance with his opinion? He's right, and he's always right. And that's where Rabbi Joshua stood on his feet and said, it is written, it's not in heaven, lo b'shamayim he. And the Gemara asks, what was the relevance of that phrase? Rabbi Yirmiyah later on says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we don't regard a divine voice. We don't listen to a divine voice. We're not interested in a divine voice because you already wrote at Mount Sinai, incline after the majority. You told us, follow the majority. That's what we're doing. That's what produces validity in our system. So if you wanted us to do something different, you should have told us at Mount Sinai in the first Shavuot. You didn't. We're doing our thing. And this is a celebration. I mean, the first time I ever looked at this story back long time ago, and most times since, people use this as a celebration of this great freedom that has been given to us as human beings by the divine. It's not quite what the story says. The Gemara relates that Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet and said to him, what did the Blessed Holy One do at that moment? I'm dying to know how God reacted to that, right? He tries to intervene and is suppressed. What was God's reaction? And so Elijah said to him, Kachiech, he grinned, and he said, Nitzchuni banai. And he got that? Nitzchuni, menatzchim. It's the same word, right? It's the same root. We said what it meant in this passage. It means contending with somebody. So it's usually translated, my children have bested me. But maybe it's better translated as my children have contended with me, have taken me on. Now when you grin and you say, oh, someone's taken me on, what could that mean? Huh. They think they're going to take me on? The sages said, on that day, the sages brought all the items ever deemed pure by Rabbi Eliezer and burned them in fire, and the sages voted to anathematize him. They go further. They now, it's not only that he's wrong here. God had said he's not only right here, he's always right. And now they, for spite, are going to say, you dared to intervene here? We're going to say he's not only wrong here, he's always wrong. So they're going to put him in cherem. And they took everything he had ever announced to be pure and they burned them in fire. Retroactively, they declared him to be wrong. And what did Rabbi Akiva do? He wore black. He wrapped himself in black. He sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 cubits. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, what's different about today from other days? It's a little Passover theme there. Rabbi Akiva said to him, my teacher, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you. This is how he's gently informing him that he's now in cherem, which means no one can come within 6 feet of him. So Rabbi Eliezer rent his garments, he removed his shoes. All this is mourning stuff, right? He dropped from his seat, he sat on the ground, his eyes shed tears, and now look what happens. As a result, the entire world was afflicted. 1/3 of its olives were afflicted, 1/3 of its wheat, 1/3 of its barley. There was other catastrophes that happened. The sages taught there was great anger on that day. Any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was burned, almost as retaliation for them burning all of the things that he had declared to be pure. So there's great rage on that day. Something is happening up in heaven. God is not accepting this lightly. And now one of the most tragic figures in the Talmud is a woman with a beautiful name of Ima Shalom, the mother of peace. She's caught between her husband and her brother because she's married to Rabbi Eliezer, but she's the sister of the patriarch Rabban Gamliel, who was the one who had to authorize the cherem. You can't put someone in cherem without the approval of the patriarch. So from that incident onward, she would distract Rabbi Eliezer from lowering his head and reciting the Tachanun prayer. You know, after the morning prayers, you do go into this supplication. You're supposed to pour out your heart, sometimes about your sins, sometimes about your enemies. And she's terrified that her husband, who is a great sage, is going to pour out his heart to God about the injustice done to him, and something terrible is going to happen to her brother. So she has to devise ways to keep distracting him so he will never say Tachanun. A certain day was around the day of the new moon. She mistakenly believed that the month was a 29-day month, such that it was now the new moon. One doesn't say Tachanun on the new moon, on Rosh Chodesh, so she's clear she doesn't have to watch him that day. But she was wrong. It wasn't Rosh Chodesh. She got it wrong. So now she comes into the room, she finds him and saw that he had lowered his head in prayer, and she said to him, "Get up, you've killed my brother." And in no time the sound of a shofar emerged from the house of Rabban Gamliel to announce that the Nasi had indeed died. Rabbi Eliezer said to her, "How did you know that? How did you know your brother would die?" This is a kind of an amazing moment, of course. You know, she's just lost her brother. She's supposed to be burying him and sitting Shiva, and they're having this theoretical discussion. How did you know that? Right? And she said to him, "This is the tradition that I've received from the house of my father, of the father of my father. Although all the gates of heaven may be closed, the gates are never closed for victims of verbal mistreatment." By the way, the father of my father is the Rabban Gamliel HaZaken, the first Rabban Gamliel. Although all the gates of heaven may be closed, the gates are never closed for victims of verbal mistreatment. That's why this story appears here. People forget that. Why is this story in Bava Metzia there? Because Bava Metzia is talking about mistreatment in commercial stuff, and then they get into verbal mistreatment, and that's where this story comes in. You should never stop this story at God smiling and saying, "Oh, my kinderlach, they're so clever, they defeated me." This is a very different story. We've seen the dark part of it, which turns out to be a story of brutally ruling out the possibility of a collective religious intuition. It's a side of the story that we rarely, if ever, consider. We love the part when Elijah we think Elijah said that God reacted in this nice way. But terrible things happen in the sequel here. And in light of these terrible things, the divine grin could only have been a sardonic one. And the phrase accompanying that grin, again, as I said before, is, "My children have attacked me or contended with me." And when they said they put him in cherem, in some sense, what they're doing is putting God in cherem. They have attacked and defeated, not God, they've attacked and defeated themselves because they've put themselves on the road to a kind of religious incompleteness that are going to handicap them for as long as attempts to help us hear the divine voice are systematically silenced. So here is a different aspect of how truth gets buried. Let us not lose the understanding of how dangerous it is for anyone to say they have the whole truth, right? But to give up and say, I don't believe that there is any point in pursuing truth, is the opposite side of that coin. Because there is a truth out there. And we may not be able to grasp it fully because we're human. But to use our human devices to serve as a substitute for it is, I would contend with you, is not to do religion. It's to do something else. It's to do something else that can be very valuable as a way of creating community and a civilization, but it's not the same as doing religion. And that, I think, is the second kind of burial of truth that I thought, as Jews and as people celebrating the receiving of Torah, we should have front and center in our consciousness on a night such as this. So we have about a little less than 10 minutes left, and I didn't see a whole lot of hands, really I didn't see any, but maybe I wasn't looking up enough during this presentation, but you may have some accumulated comments or questions that you want to put forth now, so let's take a few minutes for that. Yeah? Okay. It's okay, I'm patient. They taught us this when we were teaching assistants in graduate school, you know. Don't cut things off after 30 seconds. People sometimes need 2 minutes to formulate their thoughts. Yeah.
In the world of, let's say, math and science, when you can build everything up from first principles, I understand how you can then, because this is my world of building a world of validity. And the world of science will start out with, there'll be a hypothesis. And if this hypothesis is true, then this should be true, and that should be true, and this should be true. And Einstein did that over 100 years ago. The Einstein theory of relativity. Everything he said should happen, happened exactly the way he said. And of course, science isn't the truth. It's just a model of the truth. It models the truth better. So Newtonian physics modeled the truth in a certain way. Einstein's model was better. How now do we do this with respect to religion? How do we do this with Torah when there are things that are contradictory, and you can't do the same kind of thing here as we could do in my world?
Okay, so it is different, but perhaps not quite as different as you're suggesting. It's different because we're not dealing with observables as science does, but it's not so different in the sense that just like science, you need a scientific community to challenge each other, to challenge each other's interpretations of various kinds of observations and experiments. They are not self-interpreting. The interpretation has to be put forward. It has to be tested. It has to be challenged. You have to try to duplicate these experiments. This requires us what we call a scientific community. And religion requires a community as well. That's the difference between this and the prophecy of ancient times that had to die. It had to die because it was unsustainable. You can't have one person coming and saying, no matter how clean and beautiful his loincloth is, you have one person saying, God gave me the truth last night and you better listen to it, because there's bound to be someone on the next street corner who heard a different message. So what are you supposed to do with that? That's why you need what I would call an intersubjective kind of apprehension. That's why I suggested that it's probably best to think of Kabbalat HaTorah, the receiving of Torah, as something that happened over generations that way, with a coalescence of an understanding within what we call the Jewish community or the Israelite community of what the presence of God meant to them and was asking us to do on this earth. In that sense, religion requires religious community as well. We have to be able to talk to one another. We have to be able to share our apprehensions. I mean that in both senses of the term. Both our fears that we may be wrong, but also our apprehensions, our best understandings of what we think God is requiring of us. That, I think, is part of what Buber is saying, that you can't use the Bible as a substitute for God. Rabbi Max Arzt of blessed memory, I remember he coined the term bibliolatry, right? Bibliolatry. It's, kind of idolizing Scripture. Now, you can idolize Scripture if you believe, and by the way, if you believe that the Torah that we're going to celebrate tonight is word for word coming from the mouth of God, I will have no quarrel with you. I will not agree with you, but I will have no quarrel with you. I can't refute you, and I can't say it's an unrespectable point of view, and you'll have to contend, I don't mean you, anyone, right, will have to contend with some of the consequences of that in terms of the image of God. But if you do not believe that, then that's where Max Arzt was saying to make the Bible into entirely the substitute for that it is the only arena in which we learn the things we need to learn about God. That's a variety of idolatry, hence the term. Okay. Yes. Please. Oh, sorry. We'll get to you next.
Yeah. I'm a little tired, so I understand the difference between BS and lying. I understand the point that was made, but I'm not quite sure why it matters, why the difference matters. It's almost like a distinction without a difference. So
okay.
Could you talk more about that?
So I think it matters in two ways. I think what Frankfurt primarily was saying was that when he says that it's a greater threat to truth than lying is, that when you're lied to, you have a resentment against that person because that person is deliberately subverting what you believe he or she also knows to be true, and in the face of that, you're lying, right? When BS becomes part of the culture, then it attacks the whole idea of there being truth or facts at all, right? Because look, one of the things Kakutani talks about, she brings this. You remember those? You got to be always so wary about political stuff. But this isn't political per se. You all remember those pictures of the mall in 2009 and in 2017, right? What they found was that it's one thing if people who supported the president who was elected in 2016, if they looked at these two pictures and said, I think the one with the more people was the one in 2017. Even if they were told otherwise, right, they're going to lie about it, right? But what they in fact found, that was more than 15%, I think, of people who voted for him, when they were shown these two pictures and asked which one has more people in it, pointed to the one that was empty. That's not quite lying anymore. That's saying it doesn't matter what I say, other than the fact that I have some purpose in saying it. But that's what I meant when I said you don't have to have a memory to do that, because it doesn't really matter what you said yesterday. Yesterday, I certainly, in a different context, would have said this has more people. I mean, if I were taking a driving test and I was given some pictures to make sure that I have good vision, I would, of course, say that. But in this context, I don't need to say that because it doesn't really matter. That's where it makes a difference. I think that's what he was saying. And it makes a difference for us. I think it boils down to the same thing, actually. I said there were two reasons. I think it really boils down to the same reason, that it creates I'm again thinking of not so much of my children who are grown now, but my grandchildren and maybe their children, what it's going to do for their culture and what truth means altogether. I think that's where it becomes difficult. Yeah, I think we had. Oh, okay, we're going to make our way over. This gentleman had, yeah, okay.
I wanted to ask about the Bat Kol, the voice of God.
Yeah.
So you said, we can't rely on a singular prophet anymore, that system is past. So, and you said something about a community of scientific understanding something. But how is that different from the Lo Bashamayim Hi? What is the difference between the majority? How do we find the voice of God if not in the majority? Where else do we locate it?
Yeah. Okay, good. Everyone heard that, right, with the microphone? So, yes, I understand, and what you're saying is correct and it's valid. But the important point here is that they did not say we can't be sure that everyone's hearing the same thing here. There actually was a it was later, it was the 17th century rabbi who wrote about this and said that the problem was that it could have been someone with a megaphone standing in the midst of a fog, and they didn't know there was really God. They didn't say, we don't know that this is really God, we don't know that we're going to all hear the same thing, so what we have to do is have our community of understanding here. What they said was, God has no role in this. That's I think, the difference, right? So I don't take the message here as we should be listening to voices. It's we should not be saying, my theology is Shorsha Nagachat HaPara, the ox that gored the cow. My theology has to be an honest attempt to try to figure out what is a true and what is a false divine voice, and what are my peers hearing in that as well, and how can we come to some consensus on what we think the righteous life is.
At the place where I work, there are 2 break rooms, both with TV screens in them. And in one room, Fox News is always on. And in the other room, MSNBC is always on. And as I go from one to the other, I sometimes feel as if I'm in parallel universes. So how does your analysis help get past this? How do you understand this? What about the world that we live in gives us these 2 versions, and what do you do with it?
Yeah. So look, first of all, I recognize the tendentiousness of both of these. I don't think that they're equivalently tendentious, but that's a different story. But it is undoubtedly the case. We know this, that there are people who cannot really talk to each other because they are starting from entirely different premises. I guess one of the ways to try to heal this is for people to be studying things like this and to recognize that how dangerous it is on both ends to think that you have the truth and don't have to listen to others, or alternatively that everything is equally true. If we can get to some consensus that these 2 things are both destructive to society and destructive to civilization and to human community, it may be that we can begin to find some common ground. The fact is, people do have a lot of common ground. I said this morning that I had never had the good fortune to be at B'nai Jeshurun on a Friday night, but I was here on a Shabbat morning back in December, and that was I think it was in early December, when those correctional officers from Michigan were here. And it was a remarkable moment in which you saw the fruits of something that had happened because of reaching out to people who probably were as far away from the people who were reaching out to them from the Upper West Side as Fox News is from MSNBC. But they found common ground in an understanding of what hate is about and what prejudice is about, what human dignity is about, and it was a truly inspiring thing. It's rare, unfortunately, but it's not impossible, and that's what we're going to have to try to do. Okay. We got something? Okay.
Thank you so much for your talk. Why do you think in Judaism there is so much tradition of Agadah and commentary and multiple sources, and which in a way you could equate with postmodernism to a certain degree in terms of the narrative links? Why do you think that's such a part of our tradition?
I don't know that we're unique in that. I think that we have Agadot, we have these stories, we have this folklore because, to quote Elie Wiesel in a postscript he wrote in I think The Town Beyond the Wall, God made man because he loves stories, right? We're storytellers. I mean, that's what we are. So it's not the really important question, I think, is not why there are Agadot, but why we have somehow conditioned ourselves to consider them to be somehow a separate realm from the normative realm. Why are stories considered not to have any normative significance? Right, that they're just the sorts of things that you use to embellish the things that you're doing, but don't necessarily have any bearing on what the norms of society are going to be. I mean, the person who did more than anyone else in our culture to create a whole literature on this was the late Robert Cover, who wrote a celebrated law review article of all things called Nomos and Narrative, which is just a way of, rephrasing the term halacha v'agadah, and raised for us the questions about how and why we should be paying attention to the narratives of society, the narratives of actual people's actual lives, and how courts should be taking account of them and determining what our norms should be. That, I think, is the essential question. I don't find it surprising that we have all these agadot that contradict each other, and that's probably part of the reason, because narratives will contradict each other. One narrative will say God had to bury truth to create human beings, and another narrative may say that human beings, were created because God wants truth. I don't know if there's an Agadah just like that, but it would be perfectly normal to see that. And maybe that's part of the reason why we say, well, this isn't law-like because it's all over the map. But you want to know something? The Mishnah isn't very law-like either, because it's got differences of opinion all the time. That doesn't mean it can't be the basis for something as it became for normative texts. Why can't Agadah be a basis for normative texts if people read them, come to some understanding of which are the Agadot that ring more true, which are the ones that we really want to put into practice in our lives and make into our norms? So I think that's the real question. Yeah.
So we want to give a huge thank you to Rabbi Gordon Tucker.
Great, thank you.
For his consistent, very powerful teaching from this morning to this evening. And we have a short break till 12:15. Don't go. It's 12:15. At 12:30, we'll gather in the chapel. Rabbi Aaron Glazer will be teaching, and then we have a whole lineup throughout the night. If you don't have to commit to the whole night, so just stay up a little bit longer than you might have before as an attempt to get the receipt of Torah that we're looking for on the Shavuot. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Chag Sameach.